Students, Assalamu alaikum, and we will talk about communication and writing skills, in which we will talk about communication as a concept and the models of communication. We have already covered these concepts in the classroom, but I believe in reinforcement of ideas, so we can inculcate all these concepts once more, and we can revise them, and when we study the future topics, it becomes a lot helpful for us. So as you remember, this discussion on this topic included and the following different kind of objectives. Number one, we differentiate between the conventional transmission model of communication, and we compare it with the contemporary contextual communication model. We also identify the problems that exist in the communication, and specifically those related to transmission model. And then we try to understand three different levels of understandings in communication. And finally, we list down the assumptions that can help us to craft conversations that can effectively communicate the ideas that we try to communicate. All right, so let's start with this. Now, when we talk about communication, the very primitive definition and the conventional concept about communication is that it is an act of transmitting and receiving information. Well, it can be assumed that this concept has been derived from the revolutionary industrial age, when roads and railways and canals were built and postal services were started, and the information actually traveled back and forth from different points of transmission and reception. So usually when people received a post, they used to call it that they have received communication. So communication can be referred to that primitive concept, but this is a very peculiar model, which can be called transmission model, which was actually identified with this name by Shannon and Weaver in 1949. And they actually understood the information transmission and receiving in a very framed way. So it includes an information source which produces a message. So usually the sender of the information is somebody who produces this information on the message, and we call that sender an information source. And of course, that message which is being sent by the sender is encoded and transmitted in a particular format and through a particular channel, right? And every channel of communication has different assumptions attached to it and different methods of transmission. For example, if you email somebody, that is very different from a face-to-face conversation, and that is different from sending a message through a messenger. And a receiver of the message, a message, decoding person, or maybe a device that receives the message. And then while this transmission is being conducted, there can be noise in the message. And by noise, we mean anything which can distort the presumed meaning of message that were required to be delivered. And later on in this model, another term was included, which is feedback. And it was considered that in order to make a communication effective, you need to have a positive feedback. So the receiver not only receives the message, but provides some kind of feedback, for example, nodding of the head, or maybe a response to the email, or maybe a message that can actually confirm or acknowledge the receipt of the message. But if you look at this model is a very industrious model. This model is a kind of mechanism which is rigidly in these particular straight lines, that the encoding happens at one end and decoding happens at another end, and there can be noise in between. But the context is missing from this model. For example, if we include context into this model can be a lot more adaptive, and it can be a lot more explanatory about effective communication. So Ottaway's humorous maxims, and by this name, we can actually refer to a Finnish professor who actually studied human communication, and he was born in 1928. He said that communication usually fails and except by accident. And by this, he meant that communication is mostly flawed. It has our assumption and biases included in it. For example, whatever we perceive and we actually translate into words and sentences and paragraphs is not something which lies in the constructs of our minds. So whatever is in our mind is different from what we try to communicate, because in that translation, something is lost. And if communication can fail, it will fail. So if there is an assumption that the translation of ideas into words is not perfect, that means the communication cannot be perfect, and you will find flaws that may relate to the biases of the receiver or the sender. Also, if communication cannot fail, it still usually fails. So perceiving about communication's effectiveness can also be one of the major riddles of effective communication. Then, if communication seems to succeed in the way you intend, someone's misunderstood. So again, the mental schemas or the mental constructs are very different from person to person and context to context. So a message in one context can have a particular meaning which may vary when it is transferred to the other context, that is the context of the receiver. And if you are content with your message, if you're happy with your message, communication is certainly failing. That means you believe that there is no room of improvement, and the message cannot be improved. That is not correct. There is always room of improvement in communication, and you can always think of variables that were not previously included to improve the communication. So if a message can be interpreted in several ways, it will be interpreted a manner that maximizes the damage. So this must be the assumption that when you write or orally communicate a message, you may try to evaluate it through your own thinking, that what different forms of meaning the message can take. So what different interpretations may happen of that particular syntax, right? So, depending upon the situation and the context that you're communicating in and the channel you're using, you should think about the damage that can be caused by the misunderstanding of that message. Also, the more we communicate, the more communication fails. So this does not mean that we should stop communicating, but this means that the more we communicate, the more we know about communication, and the more we know about those constructs that have a lot of biases and dispositions that we need to crack, and then we try to make an understanding of the situation. Now, by all these points, we mean to say, or the maxims that we are using, they are humorous and they provide us a pun which help us to understand that communication in itself is a flawed form of transmitting of messages. So the negative and the damaging consequences should also be kept in mind while communicating the information. So while considering these alternatives, we should always go with the kind of alternative that will help us to ensure that maximum transmission of effective communication happens. So as I spoke about the problems with the transmission model, and one problem was context, there can be other problems. For example, what was the intention of the sender? And we do not include that intention in the model. And that intention may vary from the actual message that is being communicated. So most human communication mixes the intentional and unintentional meanings. So sometimes the tone of message and the wording that is being used may alter the intentions of the message. Also, the context can vary from one to other, and the medium that you use to communicate, to transmit the message, may actually affect upon the delivery of the message. And sometimes the transmission model can be seen as one-way street, where the sender and receiver can both actively participate. But one-way street means that only one person is transmitting, the other person is receiving. But this is not the true picture of communication, as in real life you see that people, they communicate back and forth, and the delivery of message is usually shared in the mental constructs of people. So what does this all mean? That human beings don't process information, they process meanings. So we should not only focus on the information that is being transmitted, but what meanings it can hold, what different meanings can be produced through this information, and how different dispositions and mental constructs and schemas can be developed from the transmission of this information. Right. So here's an example. For example, if you ask somebody that how they're feeling, and if the person responds colloquially that the person is fine, and by I am fine may mean that they are happy, they're feeling well, and many other situations may arise. So here are some of the examples. So I'm fine may mean I'm feeling well, I'm happy, I was feeling unwell, but I'm now feeling better. I was feeling unhappy, but now feel less unhappy. I'm not injured. There's no need to help me. Actually, I feel lousy, but I don't want you to know it. Or it also means help. I'm fine, but that's what I can say. Internally, maybe I'm emotionally not that much charged, and I might need certain help. All right, so here's a quotation about communication. There is a paradox in communicating. I cannot accept that you will understand everything I tell you, and I cannot accept that you will understand only what I tell you. So this quotation actually explains that while communication happens, we should not only understand that what was not understood, but we should also think about what else could be understood, right? So both situations should be kept in mind. So it is very important to understand that how our brain works and how our brain actually process information, so we can actually translate those ideas into effective communication. And when we communicate with each other, we we know what kind of disposition is being used by the receiver of the information. So there are two different types of models in this. One is called bottom-up processing, and the other one is called top-down processing. So let's consider the bottom-up processing first. So the brain looks for features such as shapes and colors, and happens in lower part of the brain, and then moves upward to the neocortex, where the information is, you know, juggled up and it is added up. And the addition of parts is always more than the parts themselves. There is always something extra. So the mind may only focus on the particular patterns in the information, but your mind may actually come up with other ideas, because there is tacit knowledge in your memory that can be attached to the schemas being developed through the information, and you may come up with new meanings. And then there is a top-down processing. Top-down processing actually means that you organize information into patterns and give them meaning. So first you actually organize the patterns, give them meaning, and then your neocortex actually communicates downward to break down those ideas and constructs into parts. So you are actually constructing the idea, and then you're relating and every new information with that particular idea. So it's like building a mind map. So there are two different types of processing, and usually both of these happen spontaneously in your brain, and they happen at the same time. So you are looking at the patterns, you're combining those patterns into meaningful information, and then you're deconstructing those ideas into parts that can be assembled with a particular schema in the mind. So look at this picture. This is an optical illusion, and there is a particular triangle, white triangle, in the middle of the picture. And this triangle, although it does not exist, that is not there, but your mind can see it. Now, this is a perfect example showing that how our mind can perceive what does not exist, because you have different kinds of patterns available that can actually construct ideas which were not available in the information, but still the patterns fit in a particular shape that they produce additional ideas. So this is what happens in the communication, and when particularly behavior, feeling, and emotions are involved, that people have different kinds of additional information being processed in the mind, in the neocortex, that help them develop a different idea from the perception of sender of the message. So based upon these complex mental schemas and their construction and interpretation, a contemporary model of communication was developed, and it is available that communication is a continuous process. It is not one way, it is not cross-sectional, it is not one time, but it is continuous. It happens back and forth, and it happens through a particular process which happens in the brain, a sender and receiver. And communication is complicated. So there are many parts of communication that are not actually a part of the information, but they emerge in the minds and brains of people. So that complication is something that is still very mind-boggling and that needs further exploration. So there is an intentional part of communication and there is an unintentional part of communication. The third is that communication is contextual, that it can happen in multiple contexts. For example, psychological context, relational context, situational context, environmental and cultural context. So if, for example, if two people are communicating with each other, they have a psychological, set of schema, and they talk to each other through using those mental constructs, and they communicate with the concepts that they have in their tacit knowledge. And then there is a relational sphere, a relational realm, where both have their shared meanings, and those shared meanings may fall in a particular situation. For example, if you're speaking to a teacher in a classroom, that is very different from the way you speak to a friend or maybe a family member. And because of the situation that you live in, and of course that situation help you to construct your communication in a particular form, in a different from other contexts and situations. And then you have a greater environment that actually help you to gather the words of language, to construct a particular syntax, to construct the sentences in the particular format, to assign meaning to different words and different phrases. So that environment helps you to actually communicate with other people, and that can also affect on the kind of communication happens between two persons or two groups or two entities. And finally, culture is the biggest sphere that actually influences all of these, because culture um, of different places has different kinds of interpretation of same information. So that can be effective when we talk about the components of contextual model of communication. Right, so let's redefine communication considering all these concepts that we have discussed. The word communication actually came from Latin communis, which means common or shared. So it mostly emphasizes on the shared part of communication, the meaning which is being understood by both entities, the sender and receiver, the information or meaning which is being shared between those two. So as in communion, communism, and community, if you look, these are the ideas of congregations, of aggregation of people with shared purpose, shared meaning. So communication is the process of creating shared understandings. So we create shared understandings through sending and receiving ideas all the time, and that is what we call communication. Of course, there are variables that can affect on this. There is context, there is environment, there are cultures. So all those things are a part of this communication. So when we talk about understanding of communication and ideas, it happens on three different levels. And those levels are visible in this triangle. There is a very basic, but the major part of the communication understanding, which is relationals, that we have different relationships, and with entities, with products, with people, with buildings. We have relationship with colors and smells and so on. So actually we understand things in relationship with those meanings that we assign to different entities. And then we have information, understanding of information. That actually happens in brain, where we actually construct different schema, and different verbal, vocal, and physical constructs are being produced. And we try to create a shared factual information that can be established. For example, if you ask somebody, "What is the time right now?" and the person says that it is 3 p.m. So by 3 p.m. you actually mean 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and that is a shared information. That is a level of understanding in that communication. And then the final kind of and very narrow kind of understanding of communication, which is action. And that is a persuasive form of information or communication, where you understand and you act appropriately and perfectly according to the communication. As we spoke earlier, that is not possible that you perfectly understand a message. There is always going to be some kind of noise. It may reduce the understanding or increase the understanding as compared to the perception of sender. But when we talk about actions, the persuasion may may be less influenced or more influential based upon the communication, depending upon the understanding of the receiver. All right. So um, here is a tip that I want to give you, and it was given by Chris Daines. And this is about conversations, that how to improve your conversation. Number one, copy the other person's body language to create a mirror image. And now they say that there are mirror neurons in brains that help us to imitate other people and imitate other, you know, body language, postures, and gestures from other people. And you must have heard about the fake smile, that you smile at people when you look at a smiling person. So that can happen through mirror neuron. So number one is that you copy the body language of the other person, that actually help you to establish a kind of trust between you and the receiver of the information. And number two, ask three questions, but no more until you have done the next two things. So there are two next sentence, and you can ask up to three questions maximally before doing the next two things. And if you want other information, first do the next two things, and then you ask the other information. Number one, find something from what you have just learned that will allow you to compliment the other person, but subtly. So compliment the other person, but do not make it a praise thing. Do not make it something that is being done intentionally. Make it a part of the conversation. Be casual about it, and then find something in what you have found out to agree with. So find something where you can build an agreement with the other person. Maybe this is a dialogue where you don't want to agree with the other person, but maybe there is an empathetic corner of the conversation where you are just being emotionally understanding of other person, and while constructing your argument, you're saying that I still understand your emotions, I still understand your anger, I can put myself in your shoes. But the thing is, so then you provide the factual information before that you actually agree on something. And finally, repeat until the conversation takes on a life of its own, right? So you keep going in the conversation. Do not abruptly end the conversation. Give it a slow, ending point, because abruptly ending conversations means that you're rude and you are not like a courteous person, and you do not want to communicate in a manner of respect. All right, thank you very much. So this was the revision of communication as a model, and then communication as a concept. What hurdles, what problems can be faced by a sender in communicating, and how to effectively communicate to other people in conversations. Thank you very much.